Hello and welcome on SPCL's YouTube channel. Today we will have a look at how to retrieve items using Approximate Nearest Neighbor Search. Let's jump right into it and start with the question, why do we even care about Nearest Neighbor Search? Assume, for example, that we have a web shop where we sell a bunch of different items. And the user that enters our web shop can search for different items using a search bar. In this example, say the user searches for comfortable headphones for home cinema. We as a web shop would like to recommend the most relevant items to the user. However, we are not really sure how to do this in this scenario. So say, for example, we want to recommend the 3 most relevant items. One approach how we could do this is to create a so-called vector embedding for each of our items. To do this, we feed all the information that we have for a given item. This can, for example, be the description from the company that sells the item, but also user reviews or additional information. And we feed all of this information into a so-called embedding model. This is a large language model that is specifically trained to create vector embeddings. Such an embedding vector now has multiple dimensions. This can be, for example, 1000 dimensions. And this vector represents the item and all the information that we have about an item. If we now receive a query here in the search field, then we also feed this query into the same embedding model, and what we get is a so-called embedding vector of our query. We can now represent these vectors in a space. Here on this slide we only show a 2D space, but in practice this could be, for example, 100 or 1000 dimensions. Now we see all of our database items, so the things we want to sell, as colored points, and we see our query item or our query vector here as a star. And we retrieve the most relevant items for a given query by searching for the nearest neighbors of the embedding of our query. So for example, here we select the 3 nearest points in our embedding space, and then we list the corresponding items to the user, and like this the user gets the most relevant items for his query. To do this, we need to compute the Euclidean distance between our query vector here and all of our database vectors. But since in practice we don't have 9 different database vectors, but we have millions or even billions, this is very expensive, especially if we consider that we might need to answer thousands of different queries per second. So what we need is some way of avoiding computing all of these distances, and ideally we only want to compute some of these distances. So we only want to compute the distance between the query vector and a subset of these database points. And one data structure that allows us to do this is the so-called KD tree. Here we again have our database vectors, and we now build an index structure that allows us to query this database of vectors for nearest neighbor search. What we do is first we have a look at the x dimension, and we select the median point. In this example, the median point would be this blue point here. We now split our space into 2 subspaces, left and right. And in our data structure, the KD tree, we insert a vertex corresponding to this node. Next, we split both of these 2 parts, again, this time in y dimension. And again, we select the median point in the y dimension, split the space, and we insert these 2 points as children of this first point here in our data structure. Now we have 4 different parts. Again, we split each of these parts, this time in x dimension again. We insert the corresponding points into our KD tree and so on. So now that we have this tree, let's have a look at how to query it. Say, for example, we have a query vector that is right here at this black star. And how we proceed now is that we enter the tree through the root vertex. This is this blue vertex here. And while we do this, we maintain a list of our nearest neighbors. Here, for example, we have so far only visited this blue vertex, so position 2 and 3 are empty. But as we traverse this tree, we always update this list of nearest neighbors over there. So now we look whether our query vector, denoted by the star, is to the left or to the right of the line that corresponds to our current position in the tree. So currently we are in this blue vertex. We have this line here that corresponds to the blue vertex, and here we are on the left. So this means we go to the left in our tree. We now do the same for the line corresponding for this other point. This is this line here. Here we're on the top. So in the tree, we go to the vertex corresponding to being on the top, and so on. We do this until we reach a leaf node. And right now we have our list of candidates for nearest neighbors. However, we have not yet analyzed the complete tree, and we are not sure whether or not these are the correct nearest neighbors. So what we do is we go back to the next node in our tree that we find, such that there is a children node that is not yet visited. So here, for example, this yellow node is not visited yet. Now we want to find out whether or not we should visit the subtree that is here on this yellow node. To do this, we draw a radius, or in practice, a hypersphere around our query point. The radius of the sphere is the distance from the query point to the last item in our nearest neighbor list. And now we check whether or not this hypersphere, or this circle here, intersects with the line corresponding to our current node in the tree. So we have this node, this line corresponds to it, and as we see, this line does intersect the circle. This means that in this area that is shaded in red here, there could be additional points that would belong to our actual 3 nearest neighbors, so that could still be added to this list. And since we have this intersection, we now also have to visit this yellow node. However, as we see, this yellow node does not belong to the actual 3 nearest neighbors. So here we go back now to the previous point, such that we have another branch that is so far unexplored. Here, this complete subtree here is unexplored. And again, we want to check whether or not we have to explore the subtree. So here we check whether or not our radius here intersects with the line corresponding to the current node. So currently we are at this blue node here. This is the line, and we can see that they do not intersect. Hence, it is impossible that a point on this side of the line does belong to our actual nearest neighbor. So in this case, we can avoid computing the distances to these points. And if we have a large number of these database points, but only a small number of dimensions, say 2 or 3 dimensions, then this is very efficient to avoid computing all the distances, but still delivering the correct results that we want. However, as the number of dimensions increases, say as far as the number of dimensions is larger than 20, then this data structure no longer works, and it is basically as inefficient as computing all of the distances in an exhaustive search. And since we don't know a better way to get the precise answer for our question, so to get the exact nearest neighbors, what we do is we simply approximate the nearest neighbors. Because, for example, in our webshop scenario, if we miss maybe one set of headphones, that would be good, and we recommend a just slightly less relevant headphone to the user, this is not too bad. And if we can save a lot of compute budget using this approximation, then this is definitely the way to go. And there are many different algorithms for this approximate nearest neighbor search, but one of them which performs really well is this HNSW. This stands for Hierarchical Navigatable Small World Graph. And we will right in a second see why this is called this way. So in this graph, we have a level of hierarchies. So here we have, for example, 3 different levels. Each level or layer has 2 values associated with it. So each layer has a probability P and a maximum node degree M. And as we go up in the layer, then the probability P decreases and also the node degree M decreases. Now let's look how we build this data structure. For each of our database points, we first add them to layer 0 with a probability of P equals 1. So each point is added to layer 0. We add these points to layer 1 with a probability of P equals to 0.5. So some points are also added to layer 1. And whenever this happens, we add an edge from this point in layer 1 to the equivalent point in layer 0. So when a point is added to layer 1, it is always also entered to layer 0. And then there are also some points, but this is just a small fraction of points, that are added to all three layers. And in this case, we add edges from layer 2 to layer 1 and layer 1 to layer 0. Now we do this for our remaining points. And once all the points are added, we create a graph within each layer. And now this graph, only consisting of these edges that are not dashed here, so of the solid edges, this graph has to be conform with this maximum degree here. So here the node degree, if we only consider the solid edges, is at most 1. We do the same for the next layer. Here the node degree is at most 2, and in the last layer the node degree is at most 3. And this is just a small example. In practice, these node degrees, but also probabilities are different, and the node degrees are way larger in practice. We could also have more than 3 layers and so on. But this is just to visualize the concept. Now, how we build these graphs is that we connect nodes that are close to each other in this embedding space. So as you can see, for example, in layer 0, nodes are always connected to other nodes that are somewhat in their proximity. If we now have a query point and we want to find the nearest neighbors, here again we see the query point denoted as a star, then we start at one node in the topmost layer, for example in a green one, and while we traverse this data structure, we again maintain a list of nearest neighbors. So here we have this list of the first, second, and third nearest neighbor, and currently only one of these spots is occupied. Now, if we are currently at this node, we check all of its neighbors, which in this case is just one. And if we find a neighbor that is closer to the query point than our current node, we go to that neighbor. So here we would go to this blue one. Now again, we look for other neighbors, but since we don't have more neighbors in layer 2, we go down a layer. So we go to the same point in layer 1. Again, we check all of its neighbors. As we compute these distances to neighbors, we always update our nearest neighbor list here. And we go to the point that is closest to the query point. This is this blue one here, for example. We again have a look at the neighbors. In this case, this is only the green one. Check whether or not this point is closer than our current point. Here, this is not the case. So we are at the closest point to our query point within a given layer. And in this case, we again go down one layer. And again, we check all neighbors, update the nearest neighbor list, go to the closest one, and so on, until no more neighbors are possible. And now we have a list of nearest neighbors. And in many cases, these are the correct nearest neighbors, but sometimes we can also be wrong, and these are not actually the nearest neighbors, but just an approximation of it. And in practice, if we add millions or billions of points to this data structure, then we only have to compute a small fraction of distances between the query point and data points. And many data points we can leave out and hence be more efficient. Let's also have a look at a second data structure that is based on a completely different principle, but that also performs similarly well for approximate nearest neighbor search. The second data structure is called IVF-PQ, and this consists of two parts. The IVF part is an inverted file index. To create such an inverted file index, we take our data points and we run a clustering algorithm. This algorithm now divides these points into different clusters, and it gives us the so-called cluster centroids. These are denoted by the crosses in this figure. We now create this inverted file index, which consists of keys, which are these cluster centroids, and values, which are lists of points in a given cluster. So we have the blue centroid that is mapped to a list of all the blue points, and so on. If we would only have this IVF part, and we forget for the PQ about a moment, then querying this data structure would work as follows. If we get a query point, here again denoted by the star, we compute the distance between the query point and each of these cluster centroids. We order these clusters by the distance to the query point, and we only analyze the top k of these clusters. So for example, here we have 4 of these clusters. We could only analyze the closest cluster, for example. And like this, we would only need to compute the exact distance between our query point here and all of these blue data points. And we could leave out the red, yellow, and green data points, and like this, again, be more efficient than an exhaustive search. And IVF-PQ now goes a step further. Instead of having these lists of points, we replace these lists by so-called product quantizers. Let's, for example, have a look at the product quantizer for this blue cluster over here. The first step that we do is, instead of representing the absolute position of this point with respect to the origin, we only represent the so-called residual distance. This is the distance from the cluster centroid to a respective point. So this graph here only shows the residual distance. And product quantization means that we divide our vector space, which, for example, can have 1000 dimensions, into different subspaces. So, for example, we could have 10 subspaces with 100 dimensions each. So in this example, we only have 2 dimensions in the original space, and we divide it into 2 subspaces, each subspace with only 1 dimension. And we now add our data points to these subspaces. What we do now is we again run a clustering algorithm on each of these subspaces. This gives us, for example, in subspace 0, these 2 centroids here. We have the green centroid and the purple one. And in subspace 1, we again have 2 centroids. We have an orange one and a green one. And instead of storing our data points as they are, so instead of storing them as a vector of floating point values, we approximate these points by taking the closest centroid in each subspace. So, for example, for this blue point here, which is right over here, we take the ID of the closest centroid in subspace 0. Here we have the green one with ID 0. Hence, we write a 0 over here. And we take, in subspace 1, the centroid that is closest to this blue point. Have a look at this ID. This is the 0 here. So we again add a 0. So instead of storing this complete point in this small scale example as 2 floating point values, we just store 2 integers. And in this example, these are just 2 1-bit integers. In practice, the number of centroids and hence the IDs would be larger. If we now query this data structure, we start by again computing the distance between our query point and the centroids in the IVF part, which gives us a list of product quantizers that we analyze. So in this example, we only have a look at the blue product quantizer, but the other 3 ones we leave out. And for the product quantizer, we pre-compute a lookup table. This lookup table contains the distance between our query point and each of these centroids over here. So we have the distance in subspace 0 between the query point and centroid 0 and 1. And for subspace 1, we also have the distance between the query point and centroid 0 and 1. What we do now is we can now approximate the distance between the query point and our data points by taking the pre-computed distances in this lookup table, adding them up, and then taking the square root. So in this example, we would select those 3 points as our approximate nearest neighbors. And as you can see here, we got 2 correct ones, and in practice, this point here would be the actual nearest neighbor or one of the 3 actual nearest neighbors, but here we selected this point here because we only approximated it. And in this graph here, we can see how the approximation works. So each of these different blue points are approximated by the cross that is closest to it. So this point here is approximated by this cross. These 2 are approximated by the same points, by this point over here, and so on. And here we can also see why this is so much more efficient than exhaustive search. So notice that we have different parameters here. The D represents the number of dimensions in our original space. So in practice, this could be 1000, for example. And this M here is the number of subspaces. This could, for example, be 10. And then this D prime is the number of dimensions per subspace, which could be 100, for example. And each distance computation in our original space has a complexity of O of D, but we only do these computations for the distance between this point and these centroids here. So we don't do this computation for our data points. Then in the second step, in the PQ step, we compute these distances between our query vector and our data vectors in each of the subspaces. This is only O of D prime. And then finally, to approximate the distance from the query point to our actual data points, which we have to remember that we have way more data points than we have centroids in practice. So we can have orders of magnitude more points here than we have centroids over here. distance computation is only O of m, and remember that m is relatively small, so we save a lot of computation. So far we have seen two different versions of how to do approximate nearest neighbor search. In practice there are many more. So this image is taken from this ANN benchmarks website. And as you can see, there are a lot of different algorithms, and sometimes we actually have multiple implementations of the same algorithm. And how such algorithms are usually compared is by having the number of queries per second that we can execute on one axis and the so-called recall on the other axis. The recall is the accuracy of this approximation scheme. And if we now, for example, only look at the two algorithms we have seen, so we have this IVF-PQ and this HNSW, then we see that it is not really clear which one is better. So, for example, on the SIFT dataset, we see that IVF-PQ is better, but for this GIST dataset, HNSW is better. So while there are many algorithms out there, it's not clear which one is better, since most of them, or many of them at least, are comparable in their performance. So let us come to a conclusion. In this presentation, we have seen a motivation why we care about nearest neighbor search. We have seen the KD tree, which is an algorithm that solves this problem in an exact manner, so no approximation needed here. However, the KD tree does only work if the embedding space does not have too many dimensions, so it works until maybe 20 dimensions. But for higher dimensional vectors, which are way more common today, we need approximate schemes such as, for example, HNSW or IVF-PQ. So thanks a lot for listening. And if you're interested in more research from our lab, feel free to visit our YouTube channel, which you already have found. So congratulations on that. If you want to stay up to date, then visit our Twitter or follow us on Twitter. You can also check out multiple projects of our lab at our GitHub page.